Hey dude, Amazon. Their online store can ship anywhere in the world in under 2 days. They made the Kindle and their own streaming service. But did you know they also make a phone? This is the Amazon Fire Phone, and it might just be the weirdest story ever. It launched with so much hype, but just a few months later, it disappeared off the face of the earth. So what happened? How does a device from one of the biggest companies in the world fail so miserably? Alright, let's get some backstory first. Amazon had quickly grown to popularity during the 2000s. What started out as a simple book rental service had turned into a multimedia empire. They launched all sorts of services like Amazon Prime, Amazon Music, and their own streaming service, Prime Video. By 2013, Amazon was #1 in the world in terms of recognition and brand trust, which is like a far cry from what they are nowadays. They topped all sorts of charts, from the YouGov Brand Index to the Harris Reputation Study. They were easily the most valuable rising company on the planet, and it didn't look like they were slowing down. In fact, their growth was just getting started. They began to branch out into all sorts of products to diversify their business. In 2009, they launched Amazon Basics. This was their first venture into manufacturing their own products. They released the Kindle, the Fire TV, and the Amazon Fire tablet. They became synonymous with cheap, consumer-focused, reliable products, especially electronics. They were creating services and then the devices to use those services on, and they were expanding at a rapid rate. At the same time, the phone market was going crazy. By the early 2010s, Android had just hit the scene, and it caused a huge explosion in innovation, sometimes literally. It was the Wild West, with each company jumping in with their version of a smartphone. It was a golden opportunity for anybody to jump in and take their piece of the market share. So in 2014, Amazon took the next step. They were gonna make a phone. On June 18th, 2014, Jeff Bezos took to the stage and announced their newest product. He called it the Amazon Fire Phone. He held it aloft and proclaimed that this was the next big thing in smartphones. He claimed Amazon was going to change the game again. It was released just 1 month later, and almost immediately, the cracks started to show. Consumers quickly realized how average this phone was. It used a heavily skinned version of Android called Fire OS. It had an average size, battery life, and build quality. It felt physically a lot like a cheaper iPhone, while software-wise, it was just a crappier Android.
It's heavy, but not really. Big, but not really. It's just a phone. It's all good enough without ever standing out. It's just fine.
One of its only saving graces is that it had a 13 megapixel camera, which was very good for the time, especially in low light. Jeff Bezos apparently specifically asked for a good camera, which I have to say is a good call. The camera is arguably the most important part of the smartphone. Sure, this one was really slow, but it was one of the best cameras on the market in terms of raw specs. The phone had a couple of gimmicks though. The main gimmick was the 5 front-facing cameras that work to track your face and give a 3D perspective. They called it dynamic perspective, and if you've ever used a new Nintendo 3DS, it's kind of a similar experience to that. Certain things on the screen would move as you rotated the phone. Apparently, the only reason they included this feature was yet again because Jeff Bezos wanted it. There really was no practical application, but the developers added it anyway. It worked on your home screen and with most of the app icons, and it even worked in some first-party apps. It's a cool gimmick, but at the end of the day, it's nothing more than a party trick. Both the 3D effect and a lot of the phone's functions were controlled with an internal gyroscope. On web pages, you could tilt the phone to scroll it, and then you could flick it to access the menus on the side. The second gimmick they included on this phone was something called Firefly. Basically, it was its own dedicated application within the camera that you could hold the camera button to access. Using the phone's cameras, you could scan pretty much anything. A movie, clothing, toilet paper, or even a barcode. And the phone shows you where to buy it on Amazon. This was actually pretty neat for the time. But obviously, this was a feature that Amazon had invented to help you give them more money. It was certainly helpful to some people, but at the end of the day, they were just trying to drive more sales. The phone also came with a free year of Amazon Prime and a service called Mayday, which was an on-demand tech support service. That's actually pretty valuable. The phone did all of this for a price tag of $199 if you signed a contract with AT&T. Oh boy. This is a carrier-locked phone, isn't it? The actual price of the phone was $650, but they advertised it as $199 because of that deal. So let's keep it real. Most people don't want to sign this exclusive deal with AT&T. So the actual price of the device, for most people, is $650. This was a major failing for this phone, both being locked to a carrier and that obscene price. It was barely a good phone for $199, let alone for $650. For $650 in 2014, you could buy a Nexus 6, which is just a great phone. You could buy several HTC One M8s. You could buy the Galaxy S5, and for just $50 more, you could buy the Samsung Galaxy Note 4. All of those are just miles better, some of the greatest phones of all time. You could also buy any of the newest iPhones. Although I wouldn't really recommend it. This was the iPhone 6 generation, which was the one that bent in half. I made a whole video about it. So this phone didn't really offer a whole lot more than the budget phones at the time, but it was priced like some of the best phones that had ever come out. You can see what it was up against. Which is why, before we continue talking about how bad this phone was, we should probably talk about why it was so expensive. I'll be right back. The Amazon Fire Phone was expensive for several reasons. For one, it was Amazon's first phone. They were probably expecting a huge number of sales, so they were trying to maximize their profit. As one of the most popular companies of the world, they didn't see any sign of going downhill anytime soon. Every company does something like this at their peak.
Ha ha, you fool! You fell victim to one of the classic blunders.
Obviously, there's the supply chain. As their first device, they didn't really have any experience making a phone. Therefore, as a new manufacturer, they weren't getting the best price for all these parts. They'd never built an OS before, and since they decided to, they had to make the whole thing from scratch. As in, the entire operating software, all the functions, an app store, and all of the apps to populate it. Yeah, their phone didn't even have the Google Play Store. They had to make their own. And none of that is cheap. They had to pay the parts fee for the 4 extra cameras they decided to put on this thing. They had to pay for the development of all this 3D tech stuff, the parallax effect, the screen, the eye tracking, all of that. The phone was also on an exclusivity deal with AT&T, as I mentioned, so you can imagine some of the profits probably went to them. All of this added up to make a pretty expensive phone. $650 to be exact, which is almost $900 in today's money. Now that's sort of a normal price for a phone, but this wasn't a normal phone. This was a really crappy phone. Very. Because of the precedent set with the Kindle Fire tablet, the Fire TV, and Amazon Basics, people were expecting a practical, cheaply made device from Amazon, but we ended up getting exactly the opposite. Sure, it was a cheaply made phone, but with a bunch of extra gimmicks, and it was priced like a flagship device. So you're paying flagship money to a big corporation for a crappy phone with just 2 gimmicks. Both gimmicks are no more than party tricks, and one of them is a tactic to get you to spend more money. Let's not forget that this phone was $650. You were paying all that money just for Amazon to continue advertising to you. Just like some devices today, people weren't really sure why they needed this. Couldn't it just be an app?
To be honest, basically all of this phone's features, except for dynamic perspective and I guess Mayday, could be packaged into an app, one app.
If you really loved Amazon so much and you wanted to scan objects to be able to buy them easier, why would you buy a $650 phone just to do that? This feature probably sounds similar to Google Lens, which is a software that you can access on any Android phone. Now obviously that's only on newer Android phones, you couldn't get that back then. But they did have the predecessor, it was called Google Goggles, and it did pretty much the same thing. It wasn't perfect, but it served virtually the same function, and it was just software. As for the 3D thing, it only really worked in first-party apps, and on your home screen. It was entirely a gimmick with no practical function. One cool thing it could do is if you took a bunch of photos of the same object, you could view it as a 3D photo. But that's about it. Yeah, it's cool, but totally useless. Alright, enough beating around the bush. This phone was certainly crappy, but how did it sell? Judging from the fact that a lot of you probably haven't even heard of this phone before, it did pretty awful. Like, Madam Web times Joker 2 awful. This is the lowest number I've ever heard attached to smartphone sales. 35,000 units. That's laughable. The device was so unpopular that within 2 months, the AT&T deal dropped to 99 cents with a contract. 2 months later, and the phone was 99.5% off. One of my commenters actually said they took this deal and really enjoyed the phone. But I have to say it, dude, you're probably the only one. By the end of the year, Amazon had already written off the Fire Phone as a $170 million loss. On top of that, they reportedly had 83 million of unsold phones just sitting on factory shelves. Jeff Bezos continued to defend the phone as a bold bet that would take a number of years to get right. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, those successor models never came. Amazon canceled the Fire Phone for good. In the end, it had a high price, was locked to a carrier, and at best had okay specs. You were paying for just a couple of gimmicks, one of which only existed to get you to spend more money. And because of that, basically nobody wanted them. I think Time magazine put it really well. We've made it this far in life with perfectly suitable smartphones, and a myriad of ways to buy stuff on Amazon. The Fire Phone is solving problems that nobody had in the first place. Oh, and by the way, they reused the Firefly feature and put it into something called Amazon Dash. And it flopped too. And of course, I'd like to thank all of my members listed right here. You can follow me on my Instagram, owencook.mp4. I have more videos just like this one. And party on, dudes.